Good afternoon from Ireland. My name is Travers. My talk is called Asceticism and Spirituality, a Historical Perspective on the Etiology of Eating Disorders in Women. So the reason I chose this topic is because it gives a little bit of background to my PhD work. So I'm going to present a little bit of a background, a historical context to my studies, which is about eating disorders and spirituality. And I've just finished my first year of my PhD studies. And my institute is the Southeast Technological University, and it's also a co-funded project with Spirituality Institute for Research and Education. So I'm going to explore the historical context of eating disorders throughout the centuries as they relate to women's religious ascetic practices and also their position in society. I'm going to present the framework of the female fasting saints of medieval Christendom as a mode of viewing fasting through a spiritual lens, and also as an acceptable way for women to express their spirituality and autonomy. And then I'll explore the role of food in personal and spiritual transformation. Food control practices allowed women and girls to create an alternative cultural milieu that ran countercultural to the prevailing winds of the day. Okay, so I'm going to go all the way back to Eve. One could argue that the lineage of the association, the Judeo-Christian tradition with women and food goes right back to the beginning. And as the myth of Eve suggests, the notion of women's appetites as a dangerous commodity is ingrained in our religious heritage. And interestingly, from eating disorders perspective, one of the notable elements in Eve's story is an apple, so right back to food. And it was by consumption of an apple that both Adam and Eve gained knowledge, but they also encounter the notion of original sin and they're expelled from paradise. And there's a quote there from Judith Jordan, Alexander Kaplan, Jean Baker, Miller, and Irene Stiver, and Janine Surrey. And they say the index of agency defined as self-control is supported by the culture. Historically, there has been a great fear and sense of danger associated with women's acting directly on their own impulses. Consider the myth of Eve, whose temptation leads to eating an apple, the fruit of the tree of knowledge, often described as knowledge of the self. This act was responsible for the fall of all humankind from the Garden of Eden. And this is notable because as the first woman in Judeo-Christian tradition, it establishes the foundation that a woman's appetite is dangerous and something that should be controlled. And this perspective has persisted and is the canvas upon which later generations of women painted their own stories of resistance and transformation. Okay, so just have a bit of a timeline here. Fasting for spiritual and ascetic reasons has a long historical lineage, and some historians argue that eating disorders also have a long history. So I'm going to just cover a little bit of that here. Fasting was common in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs were said to have fasted for several days before important decisions. And then also in ancient Egypt, Rome, and Greece, there was fasting before religious ceremonies. And in the ancient world, fasting in the wake of a bereavement was also common, and this was precipitated in the ancient Greek story of Priamos, who fasted after the death of his son Hector, and also the goddess Demeter is said to have fasted following the death of her daughter Persephone. And the Old Testament also references fasting in situations of bereavement, such as fasting after the death of Saul and fasting after the death of Jonathan. Early Christians fasted to distinguish themselves from the sinful, indulgent pagans around them. And the Desert Fathers and Mothers are also known for their fasting practices for ascetic reasons from the 3rd century onwards. Fasting became really normalized and part of regular everyday culture in 325, when the Council of Nicaea formalized the prescribed number of fasting days for the faithful. And then in the medieval period, the phenomenon of fasting saints proliferated, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. In the 16th to 18th century, a tourist industry grew up around a number of fasting young women who became known as miraculous maidens. People were supposed to have traveled from far and wide, from all different countries to meet these girls. I was going to go on to talk about the Victorian era, where things changed a little bit. So in the Victorian era, there was a change in the development of eating disorders. Self-control and thinness started to become moral virtues. And we see a shift happening here away from food control behaviors as a spiritual practice towards food control behaviors as a signifier of social status. food control moved from religious to culturally sanctioned actions. And interestingly, we move away here from a signal of wealth being a kind of a more fuller figure to being a signal of wealth being a thinner figure, because high-class women in the Victorian era were expected to be thin because this showed greater moral self-control, and that was the kind of supposed to be a virtue of the upper classes. The Victorians also start to use food to control children, which is really interesting. They started the practice of sending children to bed without supper as a punishment. And within this time frame, doctors start to write about the daughters of some very well-to-do families that they were coming across who suffered from this mysterious fasting disease. And they had all kinds of names around that. But the first one that really stuck was proposed by William Gull, and that was anorexia nervosa. And then awareness of eating disorders came into mainstream medicine in 1906, when Harvard Medical School invited a Parisian doctor who'd been writing about this phenomenon. His name was Pierre Janet, and he was invited to give a series of lectures, and one of which was exclusively dedicated to anorexia. So this was the first time it kind of came into kind of full awareness in the mainstream. Okay, so I'm going to talk about food practices in the medieval period. So as we know, fasting is still common in many religions to this day. But why was fasting has been such a common religious and spiritual occurrence? Professor of Human Nutritional Science Paul Fieldhouse asserts that fasting is a practice of self-control intended to nurture spiritual growth by denying the flesh. I'll focus on the medieval period now, as food manipulation behaviors attracted notoriety to individuals, and there was many people who became quite famous for their fasting, but also set the stage for feeding activities in later centuries. The female medieval fasting saints in particular allow us to create a window through which we can view fasting through an ascetic lens, because there's actually information about the female saints. But also it was an acceptable way for women to express their spirituality and autonomy. And such fasting women attained personal and social transformation through these fasting practices. And historian Rudolf Bell uses the term holy anorexia to refer to the 100 documented cases of self-starving women who were fasting for religious reasons in the 13th century. Professor of history Caroline Walker Bynum says that abstinence from food seemed a more appropriate path for a woman, especially when one considers that gluttony throughout the ancient and medieval world was considered to be a grievous sin, but it was also to be considered to be an even more grievous sin in women. Many women in the Middle Ages gained fame through their extreme fasting. However, this may have belied the internal forces of powerlessness that may have prompted their behavior to emerge. Up until relatively recently, of course, as we know, women's choices in life were quite limited. And the further back you go, the more limited nearly. So they may have found autonomy and dominion over themselves by exerting control on one of the few areas of their lives that they had power over, and that was their eating habits. Food was one of the only things that women had control over, since fathers and brothers controlled all other aspects of women's lives. It was far more difficult to flee one's family, to deny a father's plans for one's betrothal, or to refuse sexual relations to a husband than it was just to stop eating. For many women, fasting became a pathway towards autonomy, and as Rudolf Bell puts it, to be the servant of God was to be the servant of no man. Refusal of food could also be viewed as refusal to accept the societal norm of subservience, in which she as a woman could exert her freedom of choice. Professor Richard Valantassis gives some insight into the nature of asceticism itself and the role of asceticism in forging a new sense of identity and a new sense of self through behavioral changes. Through this process, the individual seeks to become a new person from an inside. They just seek to change themselves completely. But why was gluttony particularly abhorrent in women? Well, first of all, gluttony was considered to be a sin. It's one of the 7 deadly sins, etc. And in the Middle Ages, the expectation on women was towards piety that included charity to the poor and preparation and distribution of food rather than consuming it themselves. Within the cultural context of the day, extensive fasting was a culturally acceptable way for women to express their spirituality, but also their moral fortitude. The manipulation of food by women historically is largely presented by historians as having a bit of a difficult past. However, there's another side to that, and that Caroline Walker Bynum asserts that food control intake was not pathological in those days, but an attempt to gain power and heighten their own spirituality. And so she effectively locates food and behaviors around food within their cultural context. And her exploration offers the spirituality paradigm around fasting for medieval women in giving some agency to women in a time where most historians have painted just a picture of kind of helplessness or dominance. And it's also an acknowledgement that for many of these women, it was a genuine spiritual practice. It was an ascetic practice and a legitimate pathway to God. So one such example of fasting of a spiritual practice is Saint Catherine of Siena. And actually, if I can go back to the Victorians for a moment here, there was a list of kind of recommended reading for Victorian girls, the 10 recommended top books recommended for girls. And St. Catherine of Siena's autobiography was actually on that list in the Victorian era. The food practices of Catherine of Siena are well documented because she wrote about it herself, and also her confessor, Raymond of Capua, wrote about her extensively. So such was her religious ardor that she took nourishment from the host alone. But there was times where she said that she couldn't even bear to swallow that. And in those times, she found comfort in being either just close to the host, or she found comfort in being just even near a priest who had touched the sacrament. That was enough for her some days. However, medieval fasting women faced a menacing threat. So in addition to the threat of death of starvation, they also faced a threat in addition to accusations of demonic possession. They could be accused of fraud. They were accused of witchcraft as well. The threat of these kind of accusations, especially of witchcraft, caused Catherine of Siena to begin the practice of eating once a day. But then she followed that by a rather painful procedure of vomiting. And I won't go into that. It was very ritualistic. It's also interesting to note that Catherine of Siena, towards the end of her life, she claimed that her fasting was not an infirmity, and it wasn't a religious practice that she had any control of any longer. However, we could speculate as to whether this claim was due to the symptoms of anorexia. Had she just gone too far into the symptoms of anorexia that she couldn't stop herself anymore? Or was it because in those days, women were just so terrified of being accused of witchcraft that she said that she wasn't in control anymore, so that she wouldn't be accused of that any longer? We just don't really know if it was a conscious choice at the end of her life or not. Okay, so another very famous saint, very well-known saint, mystic and author, Saint Teresa of Avila, she also practiced induced vomiting for spiritual reasons only. She regularly used an olive twig to induce vomiting so that she might receive the host without fear of rejecting it. And Saint Teresa's motivation for inducing vomiting was entirely spiritual, as the host represented the ultimate spiritual nourishment, and food was considered to be an inferior form of sustenance, and which was disposable. And additionally, food was considered to be sometimes a bit impure spiritually, like you were polluting your body by eating food when you could be consuming the host or just fasting for spiritual reasons. The practices of medieval women around fasting and vomiting are indicative of the prevailing attitude, which is in that time that bodily matters were inferior to spiritual matters. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about religious overtones in modern eating disorder behaviors and where we can see that. Obviously, we have to be careful about viewing the historical occurrences through a modern lens. However, the notion of fasting for spiritual purity has relevance to modern eating disorder development, because we can see ritualistic behaviors in modern eating disorder patterns. There's almost like a religious-like quality to the way that women with eating disorders, the way they kind of plan their food regimes, the way they execute it. They're very specific in the way they do that. Even a cursory glance through the online world of the pro-anorexia and pro-bulimia social media sites, and also even sites that promote the perfect body through fitness, show that there's a really kind of almost like religious-like quality to these sites. God or the goddess has been replaced by another deity. And Professor of Religion Michelle Lelwick she gives a name to that deity. She calls her Anna, the goddess Anna. Anna is the commonly used online abbreviation in the online world for anorexia. The supporters of Anna view anorexia as a religion or something very akin to it. This is disturbing, and yet perhaps not that unexpected if we consider the quasi-religious aspects of today's popular pursuit of slenderness, with its mythical, symbolic, sacrificial, ritualizing, ascetic, penitential, dogmatic, and devotional dimensions. The goddess Anna is the epitome of the anorexic dream, especially in the Western world of ethereal slenderness. And in the West, she conforms to the blonde-haired, kind of blue-eyed ideal of normative femininity. But most of all, she's thin. The goddess Anna is very thin. Feminist scholars have also made the link between religious asceticism and the development of eating disorders, as both focus on the pursuit of a higher ideal, which involves passivity and self-sacrifice, but also has ritualistic elements involved as well. Rosa Behar and Marcelo Arancibia also make the link between control of the body in modern anorexic women with ascetic control of the body. And they say that the special relevance of the Christian ascetic tradition for the modern problem of anorexia nervosa lies in the allegorization of feeding. The sacrificial rejection of food is steady and ego-syntonic, with those personality traits centered in an altruistic and reverential ideology. However, there is a big difference between medieval fasting saints and modern women with eating disorders, is that for modern women with eating disorders, they're kind of fasting, purging, kind of regulatory behaviors around their weight are not socially sanctioned and are medical health issues. But by comparison to the medieval fasting saints, who at the time were greatly admired for their sanctity and their ability to do all this fasting.
Sarah, we have 1 or 2 minutes, I think. Do you think you will make it?
Yeah, this is my last slide, Ari.
Oh,
this is the
that's,
last one.
That's
yeah.
fine. Yeah, okay.
So I wanted to end up actually and conclude with a really nice example I found recently. I came across a lovely example of how women are using the language of the soul to describe their recovery journey. So these are the words of a 23-year-old Irish woman in recovery from an eating disorder. And she describes the journey to recover as recovery as being a deeply spiritual experience where she learned to reconnect again with the deepest parts of herself. And the painting shown here is by Roisin Duggan. She appeared with her twin sister Aisling on an Irish television program. As I was preparing these slides, she came on the television, and I found that she really spoke my language. So I'm going to end up with Roisin's words because I think she says it all. Your soul very much withers when you have an eating disorder and you become like a zombie and a shell of your former self. So every day in recovery, you are growing back a little bit more of your soul and a little bit more of your life force. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope the sound was okay. I hope I was shouting loud enough. Thank you.
So thank you, Tara. It was an impressive overview of all those ages of fasting women. I was impressed by what you told about the component of power that these girls in the past and also in the present women can be subject to, and that they try to evade it or escape it by control over their food pattern. That is, I think, still a key feature, and that you found it in those old texts is I think, of value. Are there questions here and for you? People have listened very focused and concentrated, yeah, on the historical points of view. And that saintliness now and then seems to be similar to a sort of arrogance you can see with the patients with anorexia. It can be very proud and difficult, perfectionistic and difficult to reach. So that holiness is, although they don't feel holy, I'm afraid, but it's a sort of image, a disturbing image, perhaps even. Yeah. Yes, please, Danielle. Yeah.
I don't know if she can hear me, right?
No, I will repeat it. Yeah.
No, I just really, it's very eye-opening connection that she makes, and I'm just curious if she has perhaps recommendations for churches that do fasting to sort of make it that people don't develop unhealthy habits around that.
Tara, the question is if you have advices for churches or religious organizations, right, where people have the habit of fasting and how to prevent mental disorders.
Yeah, that's a difficult one because fasting, as you know, as we just obviously discussed, it is very difficult. It's a sensitive subject because it is, in some ways, it's intrinsic to a lot of religious practices. So it's very challenging. And from a personal perspective, I've had this experience. I also work as a yoga teacher, and I've come across young women, you know, obviously coming to yoga classes to use weight, who are very clearly shouldn't be losing weight. And sometimes they come and confide in me, and they, you know, then they tell me about their struggles. So, I mean, moderation, I suppose, is the word. You know, with the church leaders, I think it would be it's very challenging. I think a lot of sensitivity, cultural sensitivity, religious sensitivity needs to be shown to religious and church leaders, because, you know, for a lot of people, it is a genuine practice.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. One more question. Yes.
One more question. Is there a correlation, are anorexia nervosa found in religious community, or is it now in secular society? Is it the Barbie culture and has nothing to do with religion anymore? Or are it religious women nowadays that are have anorexia nervosa?
Did you hear the question?
Yeah, it was about like the secular, would I be correct? It's about the secularization of eating disorders, that now they're secular.
Yeah.
Are there data about the associations between religious background, fasting, and anorexia nervosa?
There are some articles like we've heard in a lot of the some of the speakers during this conference. There are some articles around spiritual struggles and the negative effect of religious practice, or for some people who are in that spiritual struggle stage and religious struggle stage. There are some articles, and there is some data, especially coming from America, where they're finding that in fact that does have a negative, when someone's in a spiritual struggle stage, or they have a very negative view of God, that can actually have a negative effect on women with eating disorders.
Thank you very much. And there's still work to be done, I think. And you start with the beginning, so that's right. With the history. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.